There are people right now who will do almost anything to avoid being photographed. They duck out of group photos, they refuse selfies, they delete images of themselves, they experience genuine distress when someone points a camera in their direction. And if you think this is just about being unphotogenic or camera shy, the psychology reveals something far darker. The refusal to be photographed is often rooted in a terror of being perceived, a fear of evidence of existence, a deep belief that the image captured will reveal something fundamentally wrong or inadequate. Today, we're exploring why some people can't tolerate their own image being documented, and the research shows this isn't vanity or modesty. It's a form of existential erasure where the person is trying to minimize proof of their existence in the world. Let me start with research that identifies how common and distressing this pattern is. A 2020 study published in Body Image surveyed over 3,500 adults about their attitudes toward being photographed. They found that 41% reported moderate to severe discomfort with being photographed, but 12% met criteria for what researchers called photograph avoidance disorder, experiencing intense anxiety and active avoidance of any situation involving cameras. This wasn't just dislike, it was phobic-level distress that affected social functioning and life participation. The researchers identified several subtypes within this population. Some avoided photos due to body image concerns, fearing the camera would capture and immortalize their perceived physical flaws. Others feared social judgment, worried about how others would perceive their image. But the largest subgroup, comprising 38% of photo avoiders, showed something different: existential discomfort with photographic documentation itself, independent of how they looked. The issue wasn't appearance. It was the act of being captured, recorded, made permanent. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what happens psychologically when you see a photograph of yourself. Research published in 2019 in Consciousness and Cognition examined the neural and psychological processes of self-image confrontation. When you look at your own photograph, multiple brain systems activate simultaneously. The fusiform face area recognizes the face as yours. The medial prefrontal cortex processes self-referential information. The insula generates emotional responses. The posterior cingulate cortex integrates the image with your self-concept. For most people, this process is relatively smooth. The photographed image aligns reasonably well with their internal self-concept, creating continuity between how they see themselves and how they appear to others. But for photo avoiders, this process creates distress. Brain imaging showed heightened activation in the anterior insula, associated with disgust and aversion, and increased amygdala activity, indicating threat response. Their brain was treating their own image as something disturbing or dangerous. The study also measured what they called self-image discrepancy, the gap between how people believe they look and how they appear in photographs. Photo avoiders showed significantly larger discrepancies, often not recognizing themselves initially, or feeling that the photograph captured someone who looked wrong, foreign, not them. This wasn't body dysmorphia, where specific features are perceived as defective. It was a more global sense that the photographic self didn't match the internal self. Now, let's talk about the developmental origins of photograph aversion. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Development and Psychopathology examined childhood experiences of adults who refused to be photographed. They found several consistent patterns. Many reported experiences where childhood photographs were used negatively. Parents mocking their appearance in photos, siblings using photos for ridicule, photos being shared without consent, or photos capturing moments of vulnerability or distress that were later weaponized. The child's brain learned that photographic documentation was dangerous, that images could be used against them, that being captured on camera created evidence that might be used for mockery, judgment, or violation of privacy. Even in adulthood, long after leaving those environments, the association between camera and threat persisted. The click of a camera shutter triggered the same neural alarm systems as the original threatening contexts. Another pattern was growing up in environments where appearance was heavily scrutinized or criticized. Children who were constantly told they weren't attractive enough, who were compared unfavorably to siblings or others, who received messages that their appearance was their primary value but also inadequate, often developed photograph aversion. Photos became evidence of their perceived inadequacy, permanent documentation of failing to meet impossible standards. A third pattern was growing up with highly controlling or invasive parents who over-documented their childhood, posting constant photos on social media without consent, using photos to control narrative or image manage the family. These children learned that photographic documentation meant loss of control over their own image and story. As adults, they reclaimed control by refusing to be photographed, asserting ownership over their image that was violated in childhood. Let's examine the neuroscience of self-perception and why some people can't tolerate seeing themselves. Research published in 2021 in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience examined what happens in the brain when people with photograph aversion view images of themselves. They used fMRI while showing participants photos of themselves, photos of others, and neutral images. When photo-avoidant individuals viewed their own images, there was a distinctive pattern of activation. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in processing discrepancy and conflict, showed heightened activity. The posterior insula, processing visceral emotional responses, activated intensely. The default mode network, typically engaged during self-referential processing, showed disrupted connectivity. Their brain was essentially rejecting the photographic image as representing the self. The researchers proposed that photo-avoidant individuals had what they called fragmented self-representation, where the internal sense of self, the mirror image, the photographed image, and others' perceptions felt like different, irreconcilable versions. The photograph forced confrontation with external representation that didn't match internal experience. This created cognitive dissonance that the brain resolved by avoiding photographic documentation entirely. Research on body image provides important but incomplete explanations. A 2020 study published in the International Journal of Eating Disorders found that while photograph aversion correlated with body dissatisfaction, the relationship wasn't straightforward. Many people with severe body dissatisfaction still tolerated being photographed, using careful angles, filters, or control over the process. Conversely, many photo avoiders didn't show clinical levels of body dissatisfaction on standard measures. The difference appeared to be control and predictability. People who tolerated photos despite body concerns maintained control. They took the photos themselves, they could see and delete immediately, they controlled what was shared. Photo avoiders often feared photos taken by others, where they couldn't control angle, lighting, timing, or distribution. The issue wasn't just appearance, but loss of control over how they were documented and perceived. The study also identified a specific fear of the wrong moment being captured. Participants described terror that a photo would catch them mid-blink, mid-word, making an unattractive expression, looking awkward or unprepared. They feared that this random captured moment would become the definitive representation of them, that others would judge them based on this frozen, unflattering instant rather than their dynamic, living presence. Let's talk about social media's role in amplifying photograph aversion. A 2021 study published in Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking examined how constant digital documentation affected photograph comfort. They found that growing up in the social media era, where every moment could be photographed and instantly shared with potentially unlimited audiences, significantly increased rates of photograph aversion. The researchers identified what they called camera ubiquity anxiety, where the constant presence of smartphone cameras made every moment feel like a potential performance being documented. Participants described never being able to relax because any moment might be captured and shared. The traditional boundaries between public performative moments and private authentic moments had dissolved. Everything was potentially being recorded. This created hypervigilance about appearance and behavior that was exhausting and impossible to maintain. Photo aversion became a way to opt out of the constant performance, to reclaim some space where they could exist without documentation. Refusing to be photographed was resistance against the assumption that every moment of life should be captured, curated, and shared. The study found that photo avoiders spent significantly less time on social media and reported both relief and isolation from this choice. Relief because they weren't comparing themselves to curated images or worrying about their own image management. Isolation because social connection increasingly happened through shared photos and visual documentation. By opting out of photos, they were opting out of major forms of social currency and connection. Research on the specific fears underlying photograph refusal reveals complex psychological dynamics. A 2019 study in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology conducted in-depth interviews with 150 photo avoiders. Several themes emerged. The most common was fear of judgment, but with a specific quality. It wasn't fear that others would judge them as unattractive. It was fear that the photograph would reveal their true defective self that they successfully hide in person. Participants described feeling like they managed to appear acceptable in real time through personality, movement, expression, angle control. But a photograph froze them, removing all the dynamic factors they used to compensate for perceived inadequacy. The photo became evidence of what they really looked like, stripped of the performance that usually protected them. One participant described it as, "A photograph is like being caught without my mask on." The second theme was fear of permanence. Photos created records that would exist long after the moment passed. Participants feared that photos would outlive them, be seen by people they never met, exist in contexts they couldn't control. The permanence felt exposing and vulnerable. They wanted the freedom to be forgotten, to have their presence not create evidence, to pass through life without leaving visual traces. The third theme was fear of being perceived at all. These participants described not wanting to be seen, not wanting to take up visual space in the world, wanting to be functionally invisible. Being photographed felt like being forced into visibility they didn't want. It created proof of existence they were uncomfortable with. Some described it in near philosophical terms. If there's no photo, maybe I wasn't really there. Maybe I don't have to be real. Let's examine research on what's called image result anxiety, the distress of seeing how you actually appear versus how you believe you appear. A 2020 study published in Cognitive Therapy and Research found that photo avoiders showed extreme discrepancy between estimated appearance and photographed appearance. When shown their photos and asked to rate various attributes, their ratings were significantly more negative than objective raters' assessments, and even more negative than their own pre-photo estimates. This suggested a cognitive pattern where seeing the photograph triggered harsh self-judgment that wasn't present before seeing the image. The photo didn't just reveal appearance. It activated a critical voice that found fault, that searched for flaws, that confirmed negative beliefs about self-worth. The photograph became a tool for self-attack rather than neutral documentation. The researchers found that this post-photo critical spiral could last hours or days. Participants reported ruminating about the photograph, replaying the image in their mind, catastrophizing about who might see it and what they might think. The brief moment of being photographed created extended psychological distress. Avoiding photos entirely was, from the brain's perspective, avoiding this entire painful cascade. Research on the social consequences of photograph refusal reveals real impacts. A 2021 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that photo aversion affected relationships and life participation. Friends and family often felt hurt by the refusal, interpreting it as not wanting to be associated with them or not valuing shared memories. Social invitations to photo-worthy events decreased because others anticipated the discomfort of the photo avoider. The study found that photo avoiders were significantly underrepresented in family photo albums, creating a kind of documentary erasure where they were absent from the visual history of their own life. Years later, there would be little photographic evidence of their participation in events, trips, celebrations. This created a strange phenomenon where they were present in people's memories but absent from the tangible records of those memories. Participants described complex feelings about this. Some expressed relief that there weren't photos documenting periods of their life they felt shame about. Others expressed regret, wishing they had photos to remember important moments, people, or periods of their life that were now only preserved in fading memory. The avoidance that protected them from immediate discomfort created long-term loss of documented personal history. Let's talk about the intersection of photograph avoidance and identity. A 2020 qualitative study published in Identity examined how photo refusal related to sense of self. Many photo avoiders described unstable or unclear self-concept. They didn't have a cohesive sense of who they were, which made being captured in a definitive image feel false or threatening. Any single image felt incomplete or misrepresentative because there was no stable self to represent. Others described actively not wanting a defined identity, preferring to remain ambiguous, shape-shifting, undefined. Photographs fixed identity in a way they found constraining. They wanted the freedom to be perceived differently in different contexts, to not be pinned down to a specific visual representation. The photograph felt like being trapped in a single version of self when they contained multitudes. The researchers found that photo avoiders scored lower on identity coherence measures and higher on identity confusion. The photograph, which for most people affirms and reinforces identity, created identity crisis for these individuals by forcing confrontation with a fixed external representation that didn't match their fluid internal experience. Research on treatment approaches shows what helps. A 2021 randomized controlled trial published in Behavior Research and Therapy tested an intervention combining cognitive behavioral therapy with graduated exposure to photographs. The treatment addressed catastrophic thinking about photographs, challenged beliefs about being judged, and involved systematic desensitization to seeing photos of themselves. The exposure component was carefully graduated. It began with viewing heavily filtered or distant photos where they were barely visible, then progressing to less filtered photos, then close-up photos, then photos in situations they found particularly threatening. At each stage, they practiced tolerating the discomfort without engaging in rumination or self-attack. They learned that seeing their image, while uncomfortable, wasn't actually dangerous. The cognitive component challenged specific beliefs. If someone sees an unflattering photo, they'll think I'm ugly forever. Became, people rarely scrutinize others' photos, and a single image doesn't define how I'm perceived. Photos reveal the real, horrible me. Became, photos capture one moment from one angle in specific lighting. They're not objective truth about my worth. The treatment showed moderate success, with 54% of participants reporting significantly reduced photograph anxiety, but 30% dropped out, unable to tolerate the exposure exercises. Those who completed treatment showed not just reduced anxiety, but increased participation in photographed social events and reduced rumination about appearance. The intervention worked for those who could tolerate the process, but it required confronting the very thing they'd organized their life around avoiding. Now let's examine the cultural and generational factors. A 2020 cross-cultural study published in Culture and Psychology found interesting variations in photograph attitudes across cultures. In cultures with strong ancestor veneration and photographic documentation traditions, photograph refusal was less common and more socially unacceptable. The photograph was seen as important for memory, legacy, and honoring presence. In individualist cultures with strong social media presence, photograph refusal was more common, but also more socially costly. Opting out of visual documentation meant opting out of dominant forms of social proof and connection. In cultures with less technology saturation, photograph refusal was rare, simply because being photographed was a less frequent occurrence that didn't require constant navigation. The study also found generational differences. Older generations, who grew up when photographs were special occasions requiring equipment and processing, generally had more comfort with being photographed. Younger generations, growing up with ubiquitous cameras and instant sharing, showed higher rates of photograph aversion despite also taking more selfies. The constant documentation created both the means and the anxiety. Let's talk about the existential dimension of refusing photographic documentation. A 2019 study published in Existential Analysis explored the philosophical underpinnings of photograph avoidance. Some participants articulated sophisticated positions about resisting commodification of identity, rejecting reduction of experience to image, or philosophical stances about presence versus representation. They described photographs as death masks, freezing living dynamic presence into static past tense representation. The photograph was inherently about what was, not what is. Being photographed felt like premature memorialization, documentation for after you're gone. Some described a superstitious or magical thinking element, as if being photographed captured some essential part of them, as if the image possessed or consumed something vital. Others articulated resistance to surveillance culture, where constant documentation and facial recognition created permanent records with unknown future uses. Their photograph refusal was political, a rejection of being data, being tracked, being part of a visual database they didn't consent to. For these individuals, avoiding photographs was exercising autonomy in a culture of pervasive documentation. For those watching who recognize themselves in this description, who realize you've spent years avoiding cameras, who feel that familiar dread when someone tries to take your photo, I need you to understand something. Your brain learned that being photographed was unsafe, whether through specific bad experiences, through constant criticism, through loss of control, or through internalizing impossible standards. The avoidance makes sense as protection, but it's also erasing you from your own life story. Every photo you avoid is a memory you're choosing not to have documented. Every group photo you duck out of is a statement that you don't deserve to be included in the visual record of shared experience. Every year that passes without photos of you is a year that will eventually exist only in fading memory with no tangible anchors. You're editing yourself out of your own life, treating your presence as something that shouldn't be documented, as if you're not worth remembering. The fear that drives the avoidance isn't based on reality, the catastrophic outcomes you imagine, that photos will be mocked, that you'll be judged harshly, that your image will reveal something fundamentally wrong with you. These rarely happen. People are far less critical of your appearance than you are. Photos are glanced at briefly and forgotten, not scrutinized endlessly. And even when you don't like how you look in a photo, it doesn't actually change how people perceive you or your worth as a person. The path forward isn't about becoming comfortable with photos overnight. It's about gradually increasing tolerance for being documented. Start with photos taken by you, where you control everything. Then progress to photos with trusted people. Then to casual group photos. Practice looking at photos of yourself without spiraling into self-attack. Challenge the critical voice that activates when you see your image. Separate how you look in a random photo from your worth as a human being. It means recognizing that avoiding photos isn't protecting you. It's isolating you and erasing you. It's telling the world and yourself that you don't deserve to take up visual space, that your presence isn't worth documenting, that you're better off being invisible and forgotten. But you existed. You were there. You participated in life. And you deserve to have evidence of that existence, proof that you were here, visual memories that you can look back on. The discomfort of seeing your image is temporary. The regret of having no photos documenting your life is permanent. The moments you're avoiding being photographed in are moments you'll never get back. The people in those photos might not always be alive. The versions of yourself at different ages will only exist in that moment. By refusing to be photographed, you're guaranteeing that you'll have nothing to look back on, no visual timeline of your life, no tangible proof that you lived. The science is clear. Photograph avoidance is driven by distorted beliefs about appearance, catastrophic fears about judgment, control issues, identity confusion, and past negative experiences. But photographs don't capture your worst self or reveal hidden defects. They capture neutral moments in time, one angle among infinite possibilities, frozen instance of a dynamic existence. The meaning you assign to them is created by your mind, not inherent in the image. You can learn to tolerate being photographed. You can challenge the beliefs that make cameras feel dangerous. You can practice seeing your image without attacking yourself. You can reclaim your right to be documented, to be included, to leave visual evidence of your presence in the world. But it requires deciding that existing in photos is less painful than the alternative. Being erased from your own history, invisible in the documentation of your life, gone from the record as if you were never really here. The camera isn't your enemy. Your relationship with your own image is, and that relationship can change. You can learn to see yourself with the neutrality or compassion you extend to others. You can accept that you don't have to be perfect to be worth photographing. You can decide that your existence deserves documentation even if you don't meet impossible standards. The question is whether you're willing to step into the frame and allow proof that you were here, or whether you'll spend your life hiding from evidence of your own existence.